When I was 9 years of age, my parents believed that God was calling them to serve the Lord in northeast Belgian Congo, as it was then. And we made preparations for that. We got to the point we had our needles, our visas, sold our car, had our house for sale. And then in 1960, the War of Independence started, in which the Africans sought to break away from the colonialist Belgian authorities that had ruled the land for many years. And so we had to hold off a bit. We delayed our going because the government wouldn't let us travel there. And my dad was hoping that after the War of Independence settled down, we'd be able to go. But then the Simba Rebellion broke out shortly thereafter. Simba is the Swahili word for lion. And the Simbas were a rebel group that fought to, under Joseph Lumumba, sought to take over the country, and they were aided by the communists, by the Russians, the Chinese, and the Cubans. Meanwhile, the United States, with the CIA, were working to depose Lumumba and to have a more pro-Western leader there in that country. As a result of that, the Americans were, and the American missionaries there, were considered part of the enemy. And it was a sad and sorry day for the work of God in that country because many of the missionaries were horribly treated and tortured and murdered. This is one little story, comes out of a book called Out of the Jaws of the Lion by Dowdy, Homer Dowdy. It tells the story of many of the missionaries who gave their lives for the Lord during those days. By the way, the war is still going on largely in that region. Over 6 million people have been killed up into the 90s, and war still goes on. We've heard recently of those who have been executed. So that there are forces of evil at work in these countries. When these armies would march, sometimes they would have witch doctors leading the charge, and the government forces wouldn't fire a shot. They would give up because of the forces of darkness that were coming against them. And so there was a new rise in cannibalism, the most wicked violence against people. And so you had this toxic mix of communism and intrigue and the rise of animism and cannibalism, every form of evil and darkness that spread across the land. And against it, a band of intrepid Christian missionaries willing to stand for the Lord Jesus in the midst of such onslaught. There was Stanleyville was the capital of the rebel government, and just a few miles north at what was called Kilometer 8, there was a mission station. Missionaries from different backgrounds had moved there to find a place of safety outside of Stanleyville. Many of the men had been taken and thrown into prison in Stanleyville, but the women and children and just a few men were left. Men who were not Americans had been left to protect the women and children there. And this story occurs, particular night, we read that some Simbas, as the rebels were known, had come to the compound and had been looking for what they called a phone. For they were concerned that the myth was that the missionaries were using their shortwave radios to call in military aircraft to bomb the rebels, which of course was the furthest thing from the truth. But they ransacked the place, and then we read the women and children were in the house, and the 2 men were taken outside to be taken to the car and driven to prison. And the story says one Simba remained in the house, the one with the bag of sardines and the drawn gun, who was unstrung so that he couldn't stand still. Many of them were high on drugs when they were involved in these raids. He bolted for the door, but just before reaching it, turned back, ran almost to the archway. In face of the room full of watching women and children, he raised his gun straight at them. Without warning, he fired wildly into the seated group. In a moment he fired again, then a third time, and a fourth. Perhaps he shot twice more. No one really knew, for by this time who was counting the deadly blasts? Meanwhile, outside, Bob McAllister walked away in front of Hector McMillan as the rebels herded them up the driveway toward the road. McAllister had covered perhaps 2/3 of the distance to the rebel car, but McMillan had got only to the mango tree at the front corner of the house when suddenly the sickening sound of shots broke the silence. McMillan paused, as if perhaps to turn around. That was a mistake. At nearly point-blank range, the Simba with the rifle shot him in the leg, then, in a moment or two, in the side below the arm. Grotesquely, McMillan lurched back and fell full length at the feet of his assailant. McAllister swung around. He saw the blood streaming hopelessly from McMillan's body. "You've shot my best friend," he cried in anguish. The one who fired at McMillan then aimed his rifle at McAllister. His bullet, however, grazed the Irishman's forehead and spun him around dizzily. He threw himself hard to the ground. He lay motionless, crumpled in the position in which he fell. To display any sign of life would be to invite another shot, and the next time the gunman would make doubly sure that his effort to kill did not fail. The Simbas, believing their deeds done, hurried up the drive to the car. From where he lay, McAllister heard them drive off. As McAllister lay in the driveway, not yet daring to move, a second car containing Simba soldiers stopped on the road at the entrance to the compound. By their voices, he could tell they were angry in a defeat they had suffered in Stan, that is Stanleyville. By some means, they had been pushed out of the city, and in their retreat they were determined to take vengeance on all foreigners in their path. "There are foreigners living here we can kill," McAllister heard one of them say. The men headed for the house, but one, exhibiting great surprise, stopped the advance toward the prone McAllister. "Look," the rebel cried, "the foreigners there in the driveway. They're dead already." "Yes," agreed another, voicing disappointment that they were too late. "They're dead already. Let's go on." And then we read, before the last Simba left the house, before he shot into the group of women and children, Iona McMillan thought the purpose of his running toward them was to frighten them. When he fired the first time, she saw the flash and then the smoke that streamed from the gun barrel, and she said to herself, "That's a blank. He's trying to scare us, just as the rebels have done right along in shooting off their guns." However, that was not to be the case. Then they had heard the gunshots outside and noticed that both Hector and McAllister were lying out on the drive. No one dared say more or move. The four Simbas were still in the driveway. If they learned their job of killing was not yet done, they would return to finish it. Meanwhile, in the house, 16-year-old Paul McMillan opened his eyes and under the table where he had dropped saw his older brother, his face contorted from pain. "Kenny's been shot," Paul said. He felt a trickle on his own cheek, brushed it with his hand, and discovered that he, too, had been hit. A quick but nearly silent inventory determined that the two boys were the only victims of the Simba's point-blank shooting. Paul's wound was slight. Alma McAllister, having crept to him, probed it superficially and couldn't tell if he'd been struck by shrapnel or a splinter from the table. Kenneth's injury was more serious. he'd been struck in the hip by a bullet and was losing blood. Anyway, they help the boys, and then some of the ladies go outside to see to the men, and there they discovered that Hector had indeed been mortally wounded. So Bob McAllister and the two women carried McMillan's body into the house. They laid their burden on Al Larson's bed in a room just beyond where Kenneth rested in the hall. Iona looked with searching eyes at Alma. "Is there anything we can do to revive him?" she asked. "Nothing," Alma replied. The second shot had killed him instantly. Alma slipped out, leaving Iona alone. Iona, feeling her loss deeply, yet with no hint of a sob in her voice, called her 5 younger sons to her. The oldest son, Kenneth, was wounded and was being treated in the hallway. She had 6 boys. She called the 5 remaining boys to her. "Come in here, boys," she said. "I want you to see your father." Stevie, the second youngest, entered the room crying, but soon he dried his tears. This mother, who now had 6 sons to raise without a father's help, smiled softly at them all and said, "You can cry if you want. I don't think I will. After all, we know Daddy lived in the will of God, and God doesn't make any mistakes. You can be proud that your Daddy was counted worthy to give his life in the service of Jesus." Hastily, they decided that the mothers should take their small children into the forest for protection. Lunches were made and bottles filled with water. All but a few of the women and children then went down the path to the jungle. Kenneth couldn't go, of course, so the McMillans remained in the house. Bob McAllister worked on the coffin. In the quiet of the hallway, Iona sat on the edge of the long cushion on which her wounded son lay. It was a time for sharing intimate thoughts. "Mother," Kenneth said. "Yes, Kenny?" "Mother, if somehow we escape, will you come back?" "Yes, son," she said. "I'll come back." "Mother?" "What is it, Kenny?" "Mother, I think that Jesus someday may call me to be a missionary to Congo. Maybe I'll get the chance to tell the love of Jesus to the men who shot Daddy." "10-year-old Timmy, the youngest of Iona's sons, came into the hall and dropped to the floor beside Kenneth and his mother, looking up with a confident face that reflected hers. He began reciting in his small but steady voice a psalm he memorized during these past days of confinement. "If it had not been the Lord who was on our side, when men rose up against us, then they would have swallowed us alive. When their wrath was kindled against us, then the waters would have overwhelmed us. The stream would have gone over our soul, then the swollen waters would have gone over our soul. Blessed be the Lord, who has not given us as prey to their teeth. Our soul has escaped as a bird from the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken, and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth." There are still martyrs giving their lives for the Lord Jesus all around the world. More today, perhaps, than any time in history. We need to be as with our brethren in bonds, to be praying for the suffering church, the persecuted church. And may God help us, those of us who are not asked to give up our lives all at once, to be willing to give up our lives one day at a time for the one who gave his life for us.